All right, so welcome again, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this new webinar on MISRA Compliance 2020 for project managers. I am Lavinia Battaglia, CSR at BUGSENG, and our speaker is Roberto Bagnara, who, long story short, is a CTO at BUGSENG, computer science professor at the University of Parma, member of the MISRA C working group, and of the International Standardization Working Group of the C programming language. Before we start, please note that you can write your questions in the Q&A section throughout the entire webinar, and then we will read them and reply at the end. All right then, Roberto, if you want to take it from here.
Okay, so thank you for attending. Today we talk about MISRA Compliance 2020, which is the second edition of a document that is very important as it defines what it takes to make a proper claim of MISRA compliance. Here is the outline of the presentation. I will follow the structure of the MISRA Compliance 2020 document. So I will go through each section and subsection in order. The net result is that you will later be able to actually read the document and with a knowledge of what you can expect, and this will maximize your effort in studying the document. There is only a small glitch in this manner of organizing the presentation, is that I will use the word decidability before introducing it, but I guess most of you will know what decidability is. So MISRA Compliance 2020, as I said, defines what must be covered when making a proper defensible claim of MISRA compliance. It replaces its predecessor, which was published in 2016. And what is new is basically that it covers the software development process in quite some depth. And the reason is that this way, the next editions of both MISRA C and MISRA C++ will not have this material. This material will be common and factorized in MISRA Compliance 2020. The document is applicable to both MISRA C 2012, all revisions, and to MISRA C++. In this talk, we refer to these guidelines as the MISRA guidelines, okay, independently from the fact that it is MISRA C 2012 or MISRA C++ 2008. The adoption of MISRA Compliance 2020 for the time being is optional, but it will become mandatory for the next editions of both MISRA C and MISRA C++, for the reason that, as I said, from MISRA C and from MISRA C++, the material that has been factorized into the compliance document will be taken away. As I will try to explain in this presentation, there are concrete advantages in adopting MISRA Compliance 2020 now, even though now its adoption is only optional. So first, Paul, did you know MISRA Compliance 2020 already? Maybe you never heard of it. Maybe you knew the predecessor, MISRA Compliance 2016. Or maybe you are even using it, even though MISRA Compliance 2020 was published only in February this year.
Okay, so let's read the results that I've shared with everybody. So 52% no, never heard of it. 5% no, but I heard of its predecessor, MISRA Compliance 2016. 17% no, but I used its predecessor, MISRA Compliance 2016. 20% yes, I heard of it. And 3% yes, I used it. Of course, the results changes as you type in your preferences.
Okay, anyway, it's interesting. So all of you are basically in the right place today. So let's start with the software development process, which is the main part of the document that has changed from the 2016 edition. Okay, so first it's important to understand the concept of development contract. So the highest payoff from the adoption of MISRA guidelines is achieved when it is adopted at the very beginning of the project. So this is never stressed enough. Okay, and another thing to be understood is that typically the application of the MISRA guidelines it constitutes one requirement in a contract between a party called the acquirer, that is the organization commissioning the project, and the supplier, the organization developing the code. Okay, they need not be, they are typically different companies, but they may also be different departments in the same company, or they may even be the same department of the same company. So MISRA compliance is something that should be negotiated in advance, as I will explain later. So both the acquirer and the supplier need to cooperate in the task of assuring compliance with the MISRA guidelines, and it is much, much better if they negotiate what is negotiable in MISRA compliance at the outset of the project, because then expectations and what has to be delivered will be clear to everybody, and project disruption will be avoided by changing requirements in terms of MISRA compliance during the project, or even worse, at the end of the project. So the framework in which the MISRA guidelines are is a framework of documented software development. So it's a process, and this process must ensure different things, okay? That software requirements, and including safety and security requirements, especially if they are there, that requirements are complete, unambiguous, and correct, that the design specifications that reach the coding phase are correct, consistent with the requirement, and do not contain spurious functionality, that the object modules produced by the compiler behave as specified in the design, so testing, and that the object module may have been tested individually and together to identify and eliminate errors. So the MISRA guidelines should be used before code reaches the review and unit testing phases, because if you don't do this, you can expect a lot of rework and retesting, because if you care about MISRA compliance at an advanced stage in the project, where you have done already reviews, you have done testing, you may be forced to change the code in order to be compliant to the MISRA guidelines, and this would require reworking and retesting. You change the code, so you have to repeat the review, you have to repeat the test, maybe you have to design new tests or to change tests you have already designed. Full requirements for safety-related development are outside the scope of the MISRA guidelines, and they are typically contained in functional safety standards that are typical of each industrial sector. Training. It is crucial that personnel is trained for the use of the chosen programming language, so C or C++ in this webinar. The use of the language for embedded applications, which requires specific training. The use of the chosen programming language for high integrity, safety, or security related system, and also the use of compilers and static analysis tools. So compilers are very complex objects. The static analysis tools also have complex functionality. Proper training is required in order to operate these tools. There are several webinars available from our website and on our YouTube channel regarding these topics. So if you want to know more about this and other topics I will mention, I will always refer you to this webinars page in our website. Don't worry about writing down links. All the links will be sent to you by email after the webinar. Style guide. It is well known that a consistent style is important for a proper understanding of the code developed by an individual, and it is even more important that the code is understandable by other individuals for the purposes of peer review and quality assurance. So MISRA does not make recommendations in that area. However, MISRA says that it is expected that local style guidelines will be adopted in order to maximize readability, to minimize developer confusion, and to have effective and efficient peer reviews and quality assurance activities. We at BUGSENG recommend the adoption of BAR C 2018, which is compatible with MISRA C and supported by all MISRA packages of our static analyzer, which is called ECLAIR. If you are interested in BAR C 2018, there is a webinar at the usual place, and also there is a paper we co-authored with Michael Barr, and that was published in the proceedings of Embedded World 2020. So if you are interested, drop us a note and we will send you the paper as well. There is the second webinar, a guided tour of the new features in ECLAIR 3.7. Now, yesterday we released ECLAIR 3.8. That webinar was meant to present in particular the features pertaining to BAR C 2018 coverage, and it equally applies to the new version of ECLAIR. Metrics. Many software process standards recommend the use of metrics in order to keep a project under control and to identify code that may require special attention, maybe additional review or testing. Okay. The nature of the metrics being collected and how they should be used is another thing that MISRA leaves to the individual organization. However, the metrics defined by the HIS consortiums have become a de facto standard, despite the fact that they have limitations. So their conception is quite old. We are planning a future webinar in which we will explain that there are better alternatives to the HIS metrics to achieve exactly the same results in a much better way. So, tool management. Tool management is a subsection of MISRA Compliance 2020 within the software development process section. The first topic is selecting the compiler, and by compiler it is meant in MISRA Compliance 2020 what in the ISO standards is called the implementation of the language. So which in fact includes not just the compiler, but also the assembler, the linker, the librarian, and maybe file format conversion tools. So the quality of the compiler is crucial, as you all know very well. Especially for the development of high integrity systems. So remember that there are basically two options. Option one, write the code and reason about the code in assembly. Option two, write the code in C or C++, apply the MISRA guidelines, and use trustable compilers and MISRA checkers. And we are here because we want to stick to option two. We want to write the code and reason about the code in C and C++. This is why we need to apply the MISRA guidelines and use trustable compilers. Okay, so selecting static analysis tools. Of course, it is entirely possible to verify the code manually for compliance, and the cost is clearly prohibited. So tools are highly recommended to automate or semi-automate, in some cases, the check for compliance. And the selection of MISRA checking tools is also crucial. So we have had webinars in the past telling you to beware of bug finders. They are usually not good for the purpose. Beware of tools that require error-prone configuration, and beware of tools that are plagued with Lots of false positive and undeclared false negative. So false negatives that exist, but they are not declared in the tool documentation. Tool validation is a very important topic, and MISRA Compliance 2020, of course, says that measures must be taken to ensure that trust on the compiler and the static analysis tool is not misplaced. Now, the requirements vary greatly depending on the industry sector and on the criticality of the application. So at the very least, the tool should have been developed to a quality system which is up to the standards of ISO 9001. And for the development of safety-related software, tool qualification is often required. So if you are interested in the topic of tool qualification, we have done a webinar some time ago about the qualification of software tools in compliance with ISO 26262. Despite the title, many of the things that are explaining in that webinar apply to most other functional safety standards that prescribe tool qualification. So, understanding and configuring the compiler. You know that C and C++ compilers are complex objects, and the important thing to understand is that they can have thousands of options controlling the translation process. The translation process is the process whereby a compiler translates the source code in C or C++ to executable code. So the use or non-use of such option affects all aspects of the compiled code and of the source code. So the conformance to different applicable ISO standards, so there are differences between different versions of the ISO standards, so selecting the correct version is crucial. The availability of language extension and of optional language features, the resources, mainly execution time and memory space that are required by the compiled program, and the likelihood that a defect in the tool chain will be exposed. So you know that the more optimizations you enabling, the more you are risking that the translation process is faulty, meaning that the compiled code has not the correct behavior. And most compilers can implement via options different dialects of C and C++. Via what is called implementation defined behavior. This also has been the subject of past webinars and will be the subject of one future webinar. So for an extreme case, the compiler that is the native compiler in the machine I'm using for giving this presentation is GCC, targeting x86-64. Well, this compiler implements more than 100,000 of dialects of C, and these can be selected by combinations of command line options. And of course, it is crucial to understand and configure also the static analysis tool. And what has to be properly appreciated is that once you have configured the compiler, the static analysis tool must adapt to the particular dialect implemented by that compiler with that set of options, and possibly for each translation unit, because different translation units, different parts of the project may be compiled with different set of options. So, and the fact that there are hundreds of implementation defined behaviors, which include crucial things like predefined macros, search algorithm for header files, all of this is such that any failure you can make in configuring the static analysis tool can completely disrupt your MISRA compliance work. So hint is that you don't want to configure the static analyzer manually or with unreliable machinery. You want this to be fully automatic, fail-proof, and completely taken care by the static analysis tool. Runtime behavior. Another requirement of the MISRA software development process is that you should document the steps that are taken to demonstrate that runtime errors have been avoided. So, for instance, it is crucial to make sure that the execution environment has enough resources, processing time, processing power to meet the real-time deadlines, and stack space, very important, especially if we talked about stack overflow in the webinar of last week, where we reviewed the Toyota sudden unintended acceleration problem. And also runtime errors like arithmetic overflows and buffer overflow and similar things. You should document what steps you have taken to avoid them. For example, using static and/or runtime checks. Let's move to another section. So, fundamental elements of compliance. For those of you that do not know MISRA C 2012, in the next minutes, I will talk about things that are in the first page of the description of the MISRA C 2012 guideline. As I said, this compliance document applies also to MISRA C 2008. So if you are wondering, it will be MISRA C++ that will align to MISRA C 2012. Okay, so MISRA C++ will be presented in the same way starting from the next edition. Okay, so in the first page of a guideline presentation in MISRA C 2012, there is a pink strip where there is a unique identifier for the guideline. And the guideline may be classified as a rule or as a directive. So it is a directive when it is a guideline such that information about compliance is not fully contained in the source code and language implementation. So you need to take into account the requirements, specification, design, even programmer intention in some cases. And otherwise, if the guideline is such that all the information about compliance is fully contained in the source and in the language implementation, then it is called a rule. So this is important consequences for static analysis. For directives, static analysis tools may give assistance, even a lot of assistance in checking compliance with respect to the directives, but they need to be provided with the extra information required. Whereas for rules, modulo undecidability, something that I will explain soon, static analysis tools should in principle be capable of checking compliance with respect to the rule in a completely automatic way. In the page of the first page of the guideline presentation, there are several attributes for the guideline, which we will mention later. So there is a category, which can be mandatory, required, or advisory. We will see this. And there is analysis, which is an attribute which is a pair. So the first component is called decidability, maybe decidable or undecidable, and the other is called scope. And this can be either system or single translation unit. So let's start with the scope. A rule is classified as a single translation unit rule if all violations within a project can be detected by checking each translation unit independently from any other translation unit. It is called system. It has scope system if identifying all violations in the project requires to take into account more than one translation unit at a time. More often, this means the entire system, so all the translation units and the way they are linked together into a complete program. Okay, so the Guideline Enforcement Plan. So in order to use MISRA C and MISRA C++, according to Compliance 2020, it is necessary to develop and document a Guideline Enforcement Plan, GEP. And the GEP for each guideline should list how it will be checked and what is the expected outcome if there is a violation or if there is no violation. Okay. So in this presentation, which follows MISRA Compliance 2020, so we show things in full generality. In general, each guideline will be checked using one or more of the following kind of tools or manual review. So compilers, sometimes there are compilers that are able to indicate violation of the guideline. Usually they are not very good at this task, but for some restricted rules, they provide a decent output. Analysis tools, where non-compliance messages will show where and why the guideline is violated, and also manual review. So where the GEP should document the procedure to be followed. So here is an example of Guideline Enforcement Plan. So we have a row for each guideline, and then we have several columns. So in this completely generic example, we have two compilers, C1 and C2, and two analyzer, A1 and A2. And also we have a column for manual review. So this is just an example, as I said. So we might declare at the outset of the project that for Directive 2.1, we will check it by ensuring that neither compiler C1 nor compiler C2 give any error. Of course, the GEP should be, as we'll see in a second, should be accompanied by documentation explaining how you will use the compilers, and similarly for the tools. In the manual review column, you will have to describe the procedure you will follow in order to ensure compliance to the guideline. Okay, so just to give you a more realistic example, let me show you a chapter in the manual of ECLAIR 3.8.0 that contains the Guideline Enforcement Plans supported by ECLAIR. So you see that, of course, here we only deal with ECLAIR. So for each guideline, we describe what is the compliant ECLAIR outcome, and when there are additional activities, manual activities, and this is often the case, as you can see, when we deal with directives, it is written what you should do. Okay, so of course, when we move to rules, the GEP is much more interesting. So in order to comply with the rule, you just will have to make sure that there is no violation report for the corresponding checker. So MC3R1 means MISRA C 3rd edition, so MISRA C 2012, revision 1, and this is rule 2.3, which corresponds to this one. Okay? So this was just an example. Of course, if you use several tools, or if you use tools and other compilers, and you use your own manual procedures, then you will have to develop your GEP. But if you use ECLAIR, a good portion of the GEP is already done for you. The GEP should be supported by information. The information must exist, and MISRA Compliance 2020 says that this has to be supplied to the acquirer on request. So maybe the request is not asking for it. However, this documentation should exist. And for each compiler and analyzer used, there must be a record of the version number of the tool, any configuration data for the tool, what option to use, and some evidence proving that the tool is able to detect violation of the guidelines for which it is to check compliance. Point one. Point two, you should have written down the details of any manual process that is identified in the JEP. Then there is a task of investigating messages. So when you are using compliance checking tools, typically you should be prepared to receive any one of the following. So a correct diagnosis of a MISRA guideline violation, so true positive. In this slide, I have written MISRA C, but it's a mistake in the slide. So actually, this applies equally well to MISRA C and MISRA C++. So a true positive or a diagnosis of a possible MISRA C guideline violation. So the tool says maybe there is a violation here. A false diagnosis of a MISRA guideline. So since it is false, it is a false positive. Or a diagnosis of an issue that is not a MISRA guideline. So for example, if you use tools that are general purpose, so maybe you are using compiler, you will get a lot of messages that may have nothing to do with MISRA guidelines. Or if you use one of the many tools that have been engineered so as to support many coding standards, you should be prepared to the fact that you will receive a message that is actually not related to the MISRA guideline, but to another coding standard guideline. Here is an example. We have an undecidable rule of MISRA C saying that the value of the right-hand operand of a shift operator must lie between 0 and 1 less than the width in bits of the essential type of the left-hand operand, and this for a very good reason, because violating this rule incurs the risk of undefined behavior. And suppose you have this code. Okay, so for the first line is definitely non-compliant, and because the shift count is a constant, and the constant is out of range. So you expect a true positive from any decent tool. For the third line, it's clearly the code is compliant because the constant is 6. So any report given by the tool would be a false positive. In the middle line, where the shift count is a variable which is received from the caller, compliance may only be known at runtime. So the tool will do its best, but it's undecidable. So suppose, for example, that the function can be called from an interrupt service routine, and then there are no constraints about what the value of S may be, or the constraints are in parts of the code that the analyzer cannot see or understand, for example, in assembly code, and you cannot know for sure whether the code is compliant or not. So it's important to understand that all messages must be investigated and records should be kept about the investigation. So when you get a true positive report, this means that the code requires action. So you have to either modify the code to eliminate the message and be compliant, or raise a deviation. And what is a deviation will be seen in a minute. So you basically have these two choices, and depending on the category of the guideline, raising a deviation, it may be impossible. So you would be forced to modify the code in this case. The other possibility is a possibly positive report, and this may show code that, as written, cannot be statically verified because maybe it's convoluted. And so the tool get confused, so to speak. And if the tool can get confused, it's a good indication that your peers may be confused too. And so, if possible, again, improve the code and eliminate the message, and keep a record, or you may keep a record explaining why the code complies. So you may run an investigation, and at the end of the investigation discover that actually the code is compliant. You should keep a record explaining this. It is possible you get false positive reports. So this may be due to the fact that the code is confusing, or the tool is misconfigured, or the tool is faulty. So if possible, improve the code and eliminate the message, but note, improve the code. This doesn't say change the code to satisfy the tool. So if you recognize that the code may be improved, making it more clear both for the tool and for your peers, so improving the code is always a good thing. You should, in an alternative, you should keep a record explaining why the diagnosis of the tool is wrong, and check and confirm with the tool vendor that the code has been incorrectly diagnosed. Okay, so with confirmation for the tool vendor, you will, your argument will gain strength, you will contribute to improve the tools, and so on. If you get warning messages that are unrelated to MISRA guidelines, then justify in writing why the message can be disregarded. Decidability. MISRA rules are classified as decidable or undecidable. So depending on whether the question does this code comply can be done algorithmically. So if the rule is classified as decidable, then there exists an algorithm that for each source program, given enough resources, so memory space and computation time, we always produce a yes or no answer. If this is the case, then the rule is decidable, and otherwise it is undecidable. So, when it is undecidable, it is not just that we don't know the algorithm, it sees that this algorithm cannot exist due to fundamental limitations of computability. Note that limitation of available resources might prevent the use of an exact algorithm even when the rules are decidable. So suppose we have a decidable rule, but the fastest algorithm we know is cubic in the number of lines of the project. So just I'm making it up. So it's cubic in the number of lines of the project is not practical. So we cannot use the exact algorithm. We'll have to use an approximation. Okay, deviation. The deviation process is an essential part of MISRA C and MISRA C++. The point of a guideline is almost never you should not do that. So it's only for rules where you are going straight into undefined behavior that the point of the thing is you should not do that. So much more frequently the point is, look, this is dangerous. You may only do that if it is needed, if it is safe, and if a peer can easily and quickly be convinced that it is needed and safe. Because if it takes half an hour to explain to yourself or to explain to your colleagues that it is needed and safe, half an hour is too much. It should be evident that it is both needed and safe. As I always say, a useful way to think about MISRA, C and C++ and the processes around them is to consider them as an effective way of conducting a guided peer review that will enable ruling out most traps and pitfalls of the language. So the deviation process is the procedure by which justifiable non-compliance can be authorized and recorded. So the exact process is not imposed by MISRA because methods used will vary between organizations. However, the MISRA Compliance 2020 document does impose constraints on the process. So, there must exist a written deviation record, which should include the guideline being deviated, a description of the circumstances in which the violation is acceptable, why the deviation is required, background information explaining what is the context and what are the language issues involved, and a set of requirements that include risk assessment procedures and precaution which must be observed. For example, you deviate a guideline, then you may have to do extra checks, extra testing, extra activities. Okay. In addition, it is important to clarify where the deviation is permitted. So in a file, in a precise location, in the entire project. Okay. So one important thing that has been introduced by the MISRA compliance documents is the notion of deviation permit. The deviation report requires a lot of work by experienced and well-qualified staff. That is why I always say that it is useful to consider the cost of complying and compare it to the cost of deviating. So sometimes complying is cheaper than deviating. So because of this, MISRA Compliance has introduced deviation permits. A deviation permit is a document, small document, providing much of the material required in the deviation record. So it defines the use case under which a violation may be justified. For example, automatically generated code. Okay, specifies the documentation and process requirement which must be supplied in the deviation record. So by using deviation permits, producing deviation records is much easier. So using deviation permits, the supplier can focus better on the generation of any new deviation, can reduce disruption to the project development process by immediately having an easy way to deviate. It reduces the effort needed to create a review deviation. And what is most important, and I will insist on this before the end of the webinar, you can agree with the acquirer the permits before the project starts. And permits can come from different sources. So the MISRA consortiums has published the MISRA C 2004, a set of permits for MISRA C 2004. We are currently working at a new document with permits for MISRA C 2012. However, you should not wait for the MISRA permits. You can write the permits yourself. As an acquirer, you may already have approved permits, or you can produce permits. And as a supplier, you may have developed, or you may easily develop in-house permits. So, time for the second poll. What best describes your position in the development contract? Are you more on the developer side, on the manager quality assurance side? Are you more on the supplier side or the acquirer side?
Okay, so we have, well, the majority is on the developer supplier side. Then we've got 21% manager QA supplier, 5% equally developer acquirer, manager QA acquirer, and then an 8% none of the above. Okay,
so at least there is a good 30% of people who are in the position of managers of projects, which is good. Okay, so justifying a deviation. Now, the following couple of slides come straight from MISRA Compliance 2020, because you should understand that it's not me saying this, it's a MISRA Compliance document. So it says deviation must not be permitted simply to satisfy the convenience of the developer. So complying is inconvenient, is not a very good excuse. And deviation should not be permitted when a reasonable alternative coding strategy would make the need for a violation unnecessary. Deviation must not be permitted without considering the wider consequences of a particular violation on other guidelines or without the support of a suitable process, or without a proper authorization for the deviation. And not only this, MISRA Compliance 2020 goes on saying that a proposed deviation shall only be approved if it belongs to one of the following categories. So it's a deviation, it's permissible to deviate if this improves code quality, or if it is required to access the hardware, or it is required to integrate adopted code, or it is required because of non-compliant adopted code. So we will have a future webinar very soon about deviations, so MISRA Coding Standards and the Art of Deviation. This will be on July 2nd. So please register if you are interested. You will receive the link in the post-webinar mailing. So another important topic is the Guideline Re-categorization Plan. So as I mentioned earlier, every MISRA guideline is given a single category, so mandatory, required, or advisory. So it is, when it is mandatory, you have to comply, full stop. There is no deviation is permitted. When the category is required, the code shall either comply with the guideline or a formal deviation is required. Advisory guidelines are recommendations, so they should be followed as far as is practically reasonable, and formal deviation is not required, but non-compliances should be documented. So at the end of the project, as we will see, you will have to provide the list of violations, even for advisory guidelines, unless you have disapplied them, something that we'll describe in a minute. And there is no other grading of importance of the guidelines. So mandatory are the most important one, required are less important, advisory are even less important. So okay, so the Guideline Re-categorization Plan is something that before the project begins, ideally, the acquirer and supplier shall agree upon. So the allowed mappings are as follows. So if a guideline is mandatory, you cannot remap it. Basically, mandatory remains mandatory. A required guideline may be upgraded to mandatory. An advisory guideline may be upgraded to required or mandatory. And if you adopt MISRA Compliance 2016 or 2020, you have an extra option. And this is one of the reasons why I said it is convenient to adopt MISRA Compliance 2020 now, even if it is not it's only optional today, because you have the extra possibility of downgrading advisory guidelines to disapply it. So you don't even check for them. Okay, this is mostly useful and acceptable when dealing with adopted code. So it doesn't make sense to check the advisory guidelines on code that is adopted. So, and code maybe that was never developed with compliance to such guidelines in mind. Adopted code is all the code that has not been developed precisely for the needs of the present project. So it's code that comes from outside or even from inside, but is automatically generated. So by adopted code, which has to be contrasted with the term native code, adopted code is the standard library code. Device drivers may be supplied by the hardware provider, middleware components, third-party libraries, automatically generated code, legacy code, so code that pre-exists with respect to the current project. And this is such an important topic that we will devote a full webinar to this. It will be on September 3rd, and the title is MISRA Compliance and Legacy and Third-Party Code. So, in order to claim MISRA compliance, what you have to do? You have to claim staff competence. It's a crucial requirement in order to carry out the activities that allow describing a project as MISRA compliant. This is written in MISRA Compliance 2020. However, it is written also in several functional safety standards, for example, concerning tool qualification, several functional safety standards put requirements on skills of the software team members, including tool users. Okay, they have to be properly qualified. And without a proper understanding of the C or C++ pitfalls and of the reason behind each of the MISRA guidelines, the developers may perceive the adoption of the guidelines as a useless burden, so they will not, they will put resistance, and they will basically not work in the correct direction for the benefit of the project. So if they are not trained, they may misunderstand the messages output by the tool, and they may be unsure about what should be done. They will not be able to recognize false positives, and in the very worst possible case, they may start changing the code in a trial and error process in an attempt to satisfy the tool. And in doing this, more often than not, code quality decreases. So staff competence is crucial, and it is something that you have to declare at the end of the project. By the way, we have a course on MISRA C, which is called Effective MISRA C. If you are interested, drop us an email. The management process. The objective of the management process is to eliminate undisciplined development without incurring an unreasonable administrative overhead. So it's a compromise. Okay. The management of the development work is an important subject of negotiation between the acquirer and the supplier. And again, let me repeat that this is much better done before the beginning of the project. So the acquirer and the supplier should agree on the tools to be used, on the deviation process, on the guideline re-categorization plan, on deviation permits. And proper negotiation of these aspects is crucial to the effectiveness and efficiency of the compliance process. Now, assume that a guideline recategorization plan, GRP, is established at the beginning of the project for the project native code, so for the code that has been developed precisely for the current project. In addition, there is a possibility of having other GRPs for project components consisting of adopted code. Okay, for example, we may have a separate GRP for a certain piece of legacy code where we decide to disapply a certain set of advisory guidelines. At the conclusion of the project, a Guideline Compliance Summary, which is the acronym is GCS, used in MISRA Compliance 2020, should be produced, and this should record the final compliance level claimed for each guideline. So for each guideline, the GCS should have one of the following possibilities. Compliant, meaning that there are no violation of the guideline within the project. Deviation, meaning that there are violation of the guideline within the project, but these are all supported by formal deviation documentation. Violation, meaning that there are violations of the guideline within the project which are not supported by deviation or disapplied. Disapplied means no checks have being made for compliance with the guideline. At the time of project delivery, the supplier shall make the following artifacts available to the acquirer in order to support the claim of compliance. First, the Guideline Enforcement Plan. And if the acquirer requests it, this should be accompanied with the supporting information. So the tool user, the tool version, the configuration option, and so on. Documentary evidence proving which tool checks have been performed, and documentation about the violations that have been identified. So this was point one. The GCS, the Guideline Compliance Summary, should be provided to the acquirer. Details of all approved deviation permits, if deviation permits have been used. Deviation records covering all violations of guidelines that have been re-categorized as required. So the time, before concluding this time for the third poll, so do you have any present or future concerning MISRA compliant projects? So maybe no, or maybe in your organization there is undergoing discussion about it, or you have more definite information available.
Okay, so 10% maybe MISRA compliance is under discussion for an existing project. 12% maybe MISRA compliance is under discussion for a future project. 50%, so the majority, yes, I am involved in MISRA compliance in an existing project, very well. And 15%, yes, I will be involved in MISRA compliance for a future project, so that's sure.
Okay, so we are almost at the end. I wanted to show you the process and tools checklist, which is one of the appendices in the MISRA Compliance 2020. It's a checklist that you have to go through in order to produce a defensible, complete claim of MISRA compliance for a project. So you can see that we have training at the first 2 points. We have a process for enforcing style guides. There is a process for enforcing code metrics. We have configured the translator. The translator here means the toolchain, so compiler, assembler, linker, and so on. Okay, so these are the things. These 3 slides contain the entire checklist that is involved in claiming MISRA compliance. So, time to conclude. I think I am in time. So, I've tried to address the topic of MISRA compliance from the point of view of project manager. So, and this was done following the structure of the MISRA Compliance 2020 document, which, by the way, you can download for free from the MISRA website. We will provide links in the post-webinar mailing. There are several messages to take home. So, and they concern the importance of training, the importance of selecting the right tools and to validate them somehow, the importance of the development process, and let me spend again a few words the importance of a preliminary negotiation between acquirer and supplier. So this is something that we see too often. So sometimes the attitude of the supplier is something that, for example, they might say, great, the acquirer did not give us precise indications about MISRA compliance, which is great. We can do what you want. We can deviate what you want. We can develop our GRP guidelines, re-categorization plans in full independence. So beware of this, because the acquirer, you didn't negotiate before. The acquirer might be forced at a very advanced stage in the project, or even after you believe the project is almost finished, to change things. I'll make an example, and this will be particularly illuminating for those who attended the webinar we had last week about the Toyota case. So there is a required MISRA guideline saying you shouldn't use recursion in your code. So it's required. You receive no indication from the acquirer, you may decide to deviate it. However, at a later stage, the acquirer realizes that no tool can be completely trusted to compute an upper bound to the amount of stack space required if recursion is used. So the acquirer, at a late stage, maybe you didn't negotiate this, might tell you, no, you cannot deviate this thing. So it is much better if you agree beforehand between acquirer and supplier how to recategorize the MISRA guidelines. For example, very likely the no recursion guideline will have to be recategorized as mandatory because of the reason I have just said. Okay, so if there are questions, I am here to try to answer them.
Okay, Roberto, thank you very much. This is a long one, so you might want to follow it in the question section. So we have to develop generic type function like maximum between two numbers. In this situation, do we have to create multiple functions with different numeric type arguments with code duplication, or use function like macro against their 4.9 with some safety internal rules?
Okay, so I think it's much better to use differently named functions with a different suffix and different argument types. You can even auto-generate this function with some tools like the preprocessor, which you can use also independently from the compiler. And this would allow compilers and checker static analyzers to check for overflow, incongruent argument types, and so on. So you can maybe use macros only for the purpose of generating these different functions.
Okay. Is it recommended to apply MISRA Compliance 2020 to an existing project?
Okay, so it depends on what is the status of the project. So my advice would be to look at the MISRA Compliance 2020 document. Now that you have followed this webinar, it will be easier for you to follow it because you know what to expect and you have seen basically the contents of all sections. It's not a very long document, so it's I think less than 30 pages, so you can easily read it and grasp all of it in half a day. And then you can see where you are. For example, the possibility of disapplying advisory guidelines is very attractive. The possibility of using deviation permits in order to simplify the deviation process is very attractive. If you find that you are not that your process is not seriously lacking in other parts, then you should go for it. So it's something that only you can judge. Okay, so it depends. MISRA Compliance 2020 is basically a package. So there is a checklist, and if you are almost there with the majority of the points, it might be worthwhile to adopt it, even if the project is already existing.
Okay, next question. Should comments about false positives be made in a specific way in order to distinguish them from actual deviations?
Well, the important thing is that the comments, the justification should actually, in the end, prove that what happens is harmless. Okay, so it's not a different information that you have to provide.
Do you have any specific webinar on new rules added in MISRA 2020?
Okay, MISRA Compliance 2020 is a document about compliance. It does not contain any new rule. So what happened in 2020 is the publication of Amendment 2 to MISRA C 2012, which in fact adds only 2 rules, and MISRA C 2012 Amendment 2 is the amendment that allows applying MISRA C 2012 not only to C90 and C99, but also to C11 and C18. I think we can organize a webinar on this topic. So on Amendment 2, covering the added rules and see what has changed in practical terms with its publication.
Okay, thank you, Roberto, and thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. Of course, if you have more questions, please send us an email at info@bugseng.com. We're always there. Also, if you'd like to see this webinar again or share it with your colleagues, head over to our YouTube channel. We will upload the recording very shortly. In general, on our YouTube channel, you will find many interesting videos from previous webinars as well. Today's webinar, as Roberto anticipated, will be followed by 2 companion webinars, MISRA Coding Standards and the Art of Deviation on July the 2nd, and MISRA Compliance and Legacy third-party code on September 3rd. So to get the full picture, we suggest you register to those as well. I sent you the link in the Q&A section, and we will send you the link in the post-webinar mailing as well. All right, that was all from us today. Thanks again for attending, and we hope to hear from you very, very soon. Have a nice day, everyone.
Bye-bye.